So today in Bhagavan's teachings and what we're going to explore, first of all, I'll read a verse, 7 verses actually from the Ishvara Gita. I don't know who of you have read this. Leave a comment if you've read the Ishvara Gita. This is actually a beautiful translation by Andrew Nicholson. I mean, his introduction in this one is absolutely amazing. So I'll read a few verses from that, and then I'll read just a couple of verses from the Parayana. These are the poetic works of Ramana Maharshi. And so basically, I'll read just one, well, actually two brief verses about his love for Arunachala and also the type of attitude we need to understand this deep knowledge, right? A lot of people will talk about what sort of attitude do we need. And as you guys probably know from listening and watching my channel a lot, you know exactly what attitude we need. And it's also in Buddhism and Taoism, that type of mentality as well. And then we'll get into the heart of Ramana's teachings. This is Be As You Are. This is edited by David Godman, and it's actually a wonderful book, wonderful book. So, as I said, Lord Shiva's song, Ishvara Gita, this is just to give you an idea of what the unmanifest Brahman is, right? So this is a Shiva text. This is a Shiva text, so Shiva as a representation of Brahman. So this is an important text actually in South India as well. And we find this in the Puranas, so this in the Skanda Purana. So let me read just 7 brief verses to give you an understanding. So Lord Shiva said, "From the unmanifest came time, primeval matter, and the supreme spirit. The whole world was born from these 3, so the world consists of Brahman. It dwells in the world, enveloping everything, hands and feet everywhere, eyes, head, face, and ears everywhere. It appears to possess all qualities and all senses, yet is free of them all. Supporting all things, it is eternal bliss, the unmanifest, free from duality. Without any object of comparison, its range is beyond the means of knowledge. The abode of all things, supreme immortality, beyond mental construction or semblance, undivided, yet appearing as divided. It is eternal, fixed, and unchanging. It is without qualities, the highest space. This is the knowledge the wise understand. It is the self of all beings. It is the external, the internal, the supreme. It is I, all-pervading and calm, the highest Lord whose essence is knowledge. I, whose form is unmanifest, pervade this entire world. All beings dwell in me. He who knows this knows the Vedas." Now that last line will come into play as we go further and further along here, so you'll understand that a little bit more. But I wanted to mention that to you so that you guys get an understanding of the Naguna Brahman aspect, right? Naguna Brahman here, meaning Brahman without quality. So Saguna Brahman is Brahman with qualities, right? So this manifest world we live in. So in the Ishvara Gita, there's a focus on the unmanifest Brahman. And now I want to read to you, as I said, the Parayana, the poetic works of Bhagavan Ramana Maharshi. Now, for those of you who don't know, the Parayana is actually what they chant at Ramana Ashram. So you got to remember that this poetic works here, like a lot of people say, oh, Ramana, he didn't do anything. He just sat around. Well, he translated all of these into Tamil, and then they've been translated into English. And these are some of the greatest texts that you'll ever find in here. And he actually extracts a lot of the important verses of a lot of longer texts that are very laborsome. Like I've read many texts, right? And it can be very laborsome to read, say, the entire Yoga Vashishta. But then when you see Bhagavan, he extracts the important verses of the Yoga Vashishta and he puts it in here, right? And so in this one, we're going to look at, first of all, his love of Arunachala, right? This is the necklet of the 9 gems. And so I'm just going to read you 2 verses from this, right? And it gives you an idea of his love for Arunachala and also what Arunachala symbolizes. Like that's why I intentionally read those first 7 chapters of the Ishvara Gita. Now, Shaivas in the north would say, you know, this relates to the Ganga as well. And look, yes, each to their own, right? So you have the northern Shaivas, the southern Shaivas, and like the northern Shaivas would say Kailash is the physical manifestation of Shiva, and the southern Shaivas in Tamil Nadu would say that Arunachala is like the Kailash of the south. So anyway, these first two verses of the necklet of the 9 gems. Although Shiva is motionless by nature, he dances before the mother Shakti, who stands still in the court of Chidambaram. But know that in Arunachala, he stands in his tower grandeur, and she withdraws there into his unmoving self. When one inquires into the meaning of Arunachala, which is lustrous like red gold and bestows liberation, one finds that the word Aruna means Sat Chit Ananda, the identity of the individual self and the supreme self, according to the Mahavakya, that thou art. And that the word Achala means perfection. And so what Ramana translated here is Arunachala basically means the identity of the Atman, the individual self, with the Brahman, the supreme self, according to the Mahavakya, Tatvamasi, that thou art. And that chala means the perfection. So the perfection of the Atman. And so in India, you actually see, in the south, you actually see the southern Shaivas who have the tradition of the Shaiva Siddhanta, right? And so you got the Shaiva Siddhanta, and in that tradition, the Siddhas are the ones who have the perfected consciousness. And so this is a common theme that you'll see in a lot of, especially Tamil Nadu philosophy and spiritual traditions. And so in the first part, it's really interesting, right? Shiva, the motionless by nature, he dances before the Shakti, before Mother Shakti, right? Shakti, again, is the Saguna Brahman level Shakti. The power of Shakti is this world that we live in, right? And so there's two different ways to look at this, because if we look at it strictly from an Advaita Vedanta perspective, the reality itself is purely Maya, is illusion, right? And then if you look at it from an integral Advaita perspective, the world is Shakti. And so that means that Brahman is immanent within all reality, but at the same time transcends it. And so there's a lot of other integral Advaita traditions, such as Taoism, such as Vajrayana Buddhism, that speak about this. Look, in some sense, Shankara is actually, when you read the Mandukya Upanishad Kataka, for example, he is hinting at, through the measurement of Maya, that there is this integral oneness, so to speak. And if you look at the teachings of Swami Vivekananda, and there are some correlations there with Shankara, in both of the Advaita and the integral oneness approach. But Swami Vivekananda would say that he's more of an integral Advaitin because of Sri Ramakrishna followed what we would call Vijnana Vedanta, which is, again, an integral Advaita. And Shankara would say that he is strictly a non-dualist, but when you read the text, you actually see that there's a little bit either or. There's a flip-flop between both. So it's not a strict departure in philosophy, actually. Anyway, the second part I want to read was the attitude we need in understanding these teachings, even everything that I speak about on the channel, right? This is the type of attitude we need as sincere spiritual aspirants to understand this knowledge. You know, I see a lot of people in the comment section arguing about this and that, and, you know, a lot of semantics a lot of the time. And look, this is a minority in the comment section too. Most of you are brilliant, obviously, and understand this knowledge and really live by it and are enthusiastic about it. But there is a small portion that get into this analytical game of trying to split the atom without seeing intuitively. And when you understand Eastern spirituality and philosophy, it's more of an intuitive response to understanding these. You can think about them analytically, but there has to be something within you that understands it. You know, a lot of esoteric teachers would say that that was like what the divine organ is. Sometimes it's developed more in some individuals rather than others. And look, we'll speak about that in a second, because in the first part of Ramana's teachings in Be As You Are, there's a discussion with David Godman about 3 types of spiritual aspirants, which I'll mention in a second. And so these 5 verses I'm about to read to you is from the Divai Kalottaram. So, and this is Ramana's translation. And so, again, this is a spirit we need to come to understand this great knowledge. Maintain a neutral attitude towards all things. Do not be infatuated with anything. Maintain equanimity, whether happy or suffering. Be the same to friends and enemies. Treat alike a shard of clay pot and a piece of gold. A yogi should not be swayed by desires or yield to gratifying the senses and should be free from the delusion of regarding things as mine. He should revel in the self alone, free from fear and desire. Equanimity must always be maintained, whether one is praised or slandered. Equal conduct must be observed towards all creatures, and there should be no discrimination between the self and the non-self. Worldly associations and quarrels should be avoided. Not even spiritual disputations should be indulged in, whether good or bad. Jealousy, slander, pomp, passion, envy, love, anger, fear, and misery should all disappear gradually and entirely. If a man is free from all the pairs of opposites and always lives in solitude established in himself alone, he gains perfect wisdom even while in the present body and shines forth with great effulgence. I love these 5 verses from the Divaikolottaram, which is in the Parayana, translated by Bhagavan himself. And I think that that's probably one of the core things, right, is keeping that neutral attitude towards life and understanding that right and wrong, good and bad, in most cases are from our own subjective viewpoint, from our own conditioning. We're not talking about how we act instinctively here, like towards certain things, like Mencius, in the Mencius story, when he tries to illustrate that we're fundamentally good and that the child is about to fall into the well, and he asks his student actually, like, what is the feeling you have to the child? And obviously we all have this pull that we need to make sure that that child doesn't fall into the well. And so Bhagavan's not really talking about that sort of intuitive goodness that we have actually, And again, Advaita Vedanta, Buddhism and Taoism all come, and look, Hinduism in its totality comes from the perspective that we're not beasts from birth. The idea of the beast from birth comes from other religions and other parts of the world. That's where you had sin and so forth and so on. And so that doesn't relate to the Eastern traditions at all, because the Eastern traditions come from the perspective that we are fundamentally good, but we become toxic and influenced by the environments that we find ourselves in. I wanted to read that to give you kind of the perspective of like what we were talking about before, right? So when I was mentioning actually the Ishvara Gita, the 7 verses, that to understand that sort of unmanifest Naguna Brahman, the Shiva without qualities, Brahman without qualities, we need to have that neutral attitude. We need to keep our mind completely open in some sense, not intentionally too. Like this is another focus in Vajrayana Buddhism, where we find the teachings of Dzogchen, where you have the mentality of maintaining total presence, which is rigpa in Sanskrit, which when you hold that complete presence, you develop what is called the contemplative mind. So you see the pure emptiness of actually thoughts, and shunyata in that sense really means not emptiness, but empty cognizance. And so that's what a lot of people don't understand. It means empty cognizance. A lot of people, when they read Buddhism, they think, oh, emptiness, everything's empty. This is empty. The wall is empty and so forth and so on. No, it means empty cognizance. So in Vajrayana Buddhism, you have what is known as Dhammadhatu, right? So Dhammadhatu is the fundamental origin of existence, that space consciousness that we could relate to Uchi in Taoism or Nirguna Brahman in Vedanta. And it's when we come into harmony with Rigpa, you become actually a reflection of Dhammadhatu, because you become a reflection of the space of consciousness, and things are just happening within the mind, right? And without any awareness, we often wander with the mind, or we wander with our beliefs, and we wander with this and that, which is an important part of all of these traditions. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to get into this, and the things I'm going to read about in Be As You Are, the teachings of Bhagavan, is, as I said first, the 3 types of spiritual aspirants. We're going to talk about the nature of self-realization, the aid of a guru, dealing with desires, is the world an illusion, and is the world created for happiness or misery? And so one of the things I'm first going to say to you guys before I get into that is that when people talk about Ramana Maharshi's teachings, a lot of people talk about self-inquiry, right? They talk about Atma Vicharya. And so when you've read the transcripts of Bhagavan, when you understand his teachings, he recommended Atma Vicharya, self-inquiry. So this is the who am I, right? But the real translation should be what am I, because who implies a person. And so he recommended Atma Vicharya as a way to sort of till the soil in your mind to understand the Brahma Vidya. Because when people came to Bhagavan, they saw that he was an enlightened being, and they were thinking like, how do I attain this? Like, Again, I is in the way here, but we don't want to split the atom again. But how do I become a knower of Brahman? This is what the Brahma Vidya is, right? The knowledge of Brahman, or Brahmajnana, if you want, the wisdom of Brahman. And so when they came to him and they could feel the power of his silence, they could feel the power when he would speak, or they could feel his presence in general. They always inquired, like, how do I get this? And like for Ramana, it was like, if you can't hear this music, right? Like, like for example, with classical music, some people hate classical music, but if you can hear classical music and you can understand it, then there's something there. And for Bhagavan, it was much like that. He could not explain this absorption that he has in Brahman, right? There's not really any words to do it, but what he could offer as a preliminary practice to try and abide in that was Atmavicharya. Now, what's interesting in the modern day, I don't know how many of you guys actually watch other teachers and this and that, but there's a lot of neo-Advaita teachers around, right? So a lot of neo-Advaita teachers don't stick to tradition. They've never learned the Brahma Vidya. They've never even read the great texts, but they know Who Am I by Ramana, right? And so they run with this idea of who am I? And then their satsangs reflect this, where they're just constantly in the inquiry. It becomes a bit of a head case, right? And so then you find the devotees of these people sitting like, who am I? Who am I? Who am I? Who am I? It's on repeat, right? And so this is a big problem. This is actually not what Ramana wanted, obviously. He wanted us to obviously practice Atmavicharya, self-inquiry, if we weren't at that stage of understanding that Atman is Brahman, right? And so a lot of these neo-Advaita teachers stay in the inquiry, but they're not focused on the beyond, on the Brahma Vidya, on the Brahma Gyan. They're not focused on that. They're focused on just stay in the inquiry. Who am I? Who am I? Who am I? And what happens is as I said, a lot of devotees just go crazy because it's not natural just to be sitting around all day going, who am I? Who am I? Who am I? Because what happens is the ego starts thinking about itself. It starts asking the question, who am I? Who am I? Who am I? And then it associates some sort of attainment with itself. And then you have people walking around saying that they're an enlightened being and so forth and so on. And no, that's not how it works, because no one can claim that they are enlightened. No one can claim that they're enlightened, because the one that claims it is the ego itself. If you've disappeared, if the jiva, the ego persona system, has evaporated and disappeared, all that is left is Brahman. And so, as I said, I'm going to first mention to you the three types of spiritual aspirants. And so this is from David Godman, actually. This is David Godman's words before we get into the Q&A, the transcript of the first part, the nature of self-realization. Sri Ramana occasionally indicated that there were three classes of spiritual aspirants. The most advanced realize the self, Atman, as soon as they are told about its nature. Those in the second class need to reflect on it for some time before self-awareness becomes firmly established. Those in the third category are less fortunate, since they usually need many years of intensive spiritual practice to achieve the goal of self-realization. Sri Ramana sometimes used a metaphor of combustion to describe the three levels. Gunpowder ignites with a single spark. Charcoal needs the application of heat for a short time, and wet coal needs to dry out and heat up over a long period of time before it will begin to burn. For the benefit of those in the top two categories, Sri Ramana taught that the self alone exists and that it can be directly and consciously experienced merely by ceasing to pay attention to the wrong ideas we have about ourselves. These wrong ideas he collectively called the not-self, since they are an imaginary accretion of wrong notions and misperceptions which effectively veil the true experience of the real self. The principal misperception is the idea that the self, Atman, is limited to the body and the mind. As soon as one ceases to imagine that one is an individual person inhabiting a particular body, the whole superstructure of wrong ideas collapses and is replaced by a conscious and permanent awareness of the real self, the Atman. At this level of the teaching, there is no question of effort or practice. All that is required is an understanding that the self is not a goal to be attained. It is merely the awareness that prevails when all the limiting ideas about the not-self have been discarded. David sets this out because in this chapter, Ramana is asked about self-realization, like, because okay, so there's two, the first two ones, right, when he uses combustion, right? So we have the gunpowder ignites with a single spark. So I could say to you, you are that, you are Atman, and boom, you're already there. Tatvamasi. This makes sense to you completely. And then the second one, charcoal needs the application of heat for a short time, right? So there's a need for probably a little bit of sadhana, right? A little bit of practice, a little bit of study, a little bit of understanding. And then the third aspect, which many of us probably fall into, is the wet coal needs to dry out and heat up over a long period of time before it will begin to burn. Now, that's where one needs to dedicate a certain period of time for intense sadhana. So intense spiritual practice, probably isolation, good to be a recluse for a while and this and that, to try and eliminate a lot of the not self, as Ramana said, a lot of wrong thinking and a lot of subjective thinking about ourselves, right? Like, so a lot of the problem with spirituality in the modern day is because individuality is constantly promoted all throughout the world, even though Eastern cultures aren't individualistic in their nature, but they are slowly becoming like that, is people ruminate on themselves. They start to think about themselves all the time. And this, unfortunately, is why Westerners have an urge to say that they're enlightened, because they come from an individualistic culture and they think they are the one that's going to be enlightened. It's the grace of Shiva. It truly is the grace of Shiva that touches your heart. Some people realize it straight away, like Bhagavan, or some people take many years. We could even look at Patanjali, right, as the founding father of yoga. When he had the 8 limbs of yoga, maybe this was Patanjali being in the third category. Now, again, like I said, these 3 categories are not like one is better than the other. It's just that we all have different circumstances in life. You know, we all come from different upbringings. We all are blessed with certain different cards and privileges than other people. But that's not supposed to deter you from the path. You're not supposed to play the victim in all of this. I know that's in vogue these days, right? And I remember one teacher said to me when we were sitting around satsang, is that obviously the great blessing is for someone to be born into a yogi's family, right? And so not many of us can say that we were born into a yogi's family. But I'm sure that all of your parents were exactly where you needed to be, and they were loving people in and of themselves. I know my parents were, but my parents were pretty far removed from the spiritual sphere because they lived in a different time and they had different circumstances, right? So in response to these 3 spiritual aspirants, I'll read to you this little dialogue between Ramana and a devotee. So the devotee says to Ramana, how can I attain self-realization? You know, this is a very generic, very practical inquiry. Ramana says, realization is nothing to be gained afresh. It is already there. All that is necessary is to get rid of the thought, I have not realized. Stillness or peace is realization. There is no moment when the self is not. So long as there is doubt or the feeling of non-realization, the attempt should be made to rid oneself of these thoughts. They are due to the identification of the self with the not self. When the not self disappears, the self alone remains. To make room, it is enough that objects be removed. Room is not brought in from elsewhere. And so the devotee follows up. Since realization is not possible without vasana kishaya, the destruction of mental tendencies, how am I to realize that state in which the tendencies are effectively destroyed? And Ramana says, you are in that state now. The devotee replies, does it mean that by holding on to the self, the vasanas, the mental tendencies, should be destroyed as and when they emerge? Ramana replies, they will themselves be destroyed if you remain as you are. The devotee asks, how shall I reach the self? Ramana says, there is no reaching the self. If self were to be reached, it would mean that the self is not here and now, and that is yet to be obtained. What is got afresh will also be lost, so it will be impermanent. What is not permanent is not worth striving for. So I say the self is not reached. You are the self. You are already that. The fact is, you are ignorant of your blissful state. Ignorance supervenes and draws a veil over the pure self, which is blissful. Attempts are directed only to remove the veil of ignorance, which is merely wrong knowledge. The wrong knowledge is the false identification of the self with the body and the mind. This false identification must go, and then the self alone remains. Therefore, realization is for everyone. Realization makes no difference between the aspirants. This very doubt whether you can realize and the notion I have not realized are themselves the obstacles. Be free from these obstacles also. The devotee follows up. How long does it take to reach mukti, liberation? Mukti is not to be gained in the future. It is there forever, here and now. And so then the devotee follows up. I agree, but I do not experience it. Ramana says, the experience is here and now. One cannot deny one's own self. And then the devotee says, that means existence and not happiness. Ramana says, existence is the same as happiness, and happiness is the same as being. The word mukti is so provoking. Why should one seek it? One believes that there is bondage and therefore seeks liberation. But the fact is that there is no bondage, but only liberation. Why call it by a name and seek it? And then the devotee follows up, true, but we are ignorant. Ramana says, only remove ignorance. That is all there is to be done. All questions relating to mukti are inadmissible. Mukti means release from bondage, which implies the present existence of bondage. There is no bondage and therefore no mukti. And so that's something for us to think about, right? If we are already eternally that, we are the Atman, which is Brahman. We are that undifferentiated consciousness. But the persona system veils it, right? So we've got this veil and we can't see reality aright. We can't see it in its true place. But once we understand, as we get to the, let's say, the state of consciousness of a Jivan Mukta like Ramana, then you understand that there is no bondage and therefore no Mukti either, because Mukti is related to the persona system. I want release from bondage. So it's from something, right? But you're already that. And Ramana keeps reminding people, you're already that. You keep telling me this story about who you are, and the story is a fiction story. It's not a real story. And so Ramana is not saying that in the sense that you don't exist, that you don't have obligations, that you don't have social duty. He's saying it from the deepest perspective that if you don't know who you truly are at the depth, then it's difficult to function in this world because you'll always suffer because you'll be a victim of who you think you are, right? And so the devotee follows up, not exactly straight after, but with a similar question, right? Where it says, there must be something that I can do to reach this state, right? So again, the devotee is confused about this. Like Ramana keeps telling the devotee, look, this is who you are. Like we're fundamentally this. The obstacle is that we think it's somewhere to search for. We think it's a goal or a destination to get to. You know, this is the crux of my book, Enlightenment Now, right? The idea that enlightenment is only ever present in this reality, but it's our time-bound ego that kind of gets in the way and kind of turns spiritual knowledge into something where we need to attain something or we need to have success, spiritual success or whatnot. And so Ramana follows up with that question. The conception that there is a goal and a path to it is wrong. We are the goal or peace always. To get rid of the notion that we are not peace is all that is required. And then the devotee says, all books say that the guidance of a guru is necessary. And Ramana has an interesting reply to this. You know, a lot of people have a nervous reaction about the idea of a guru in the modern day, right? Because deference, because we have become an individualistic culture, deference is something that gets kind of put on the back burner. And so once deference gets put on the back burner, what's one of the main qualities that humans have that just gets destroyed? Humility. And so the answer here, Ramana says, the guru will say only what I'm saying now. He will not give you anything you have not already got. It is impossible for anyone to get what he has not got already. Even if he gets any such thing, it will go as it came. What comes will also go. What always is will alone remain. The guru cannot give you anything new which you don't already have. Removal of the notion that we have not realized the self is all that is required. We are always the self, only we don't realize it. We go around and round in search of Atman, self, saying, where is Atman? Where is it? Till at last the dawn of Jnana Dristi. Now, Jnana Dristi means the vision of knowledge. Now here, the vision of knowledge is the knowledge of Brahman. So the dawn of Jnana Dristi is reached, and we say, this Atman, This is me. We should acquire that vision. When once that vision is reached, there will be no attachments, even if one mixes with the world and moves about in it. When once you put on shoes, your feet do not feel the pain of walking on any number of stones or thorns on the way. You walk about without fear or care, even if there are mountains on the way. In the same way, everything will be natural to those who have attained Jnana Drishti. What is there apart from one's own self? And then the devotee follows up. The natural state can be known only after all this worldly vision subsides. But how is it to subside? Again, asking how to reach it. How do I reach it? The penny hasn't dropped here, right? And this is one of the curiosities that Zhuangzi also has about humanity. Because when he talks about Xiao Yao Yu means free and easy wandering. It's a state of enlightenment, state of consciousness where one moves through the world, but it's not stuck to any aspect of it. Not even stuck to the idea of the spiritual concepts. And so it's like the Japanese word unsui. So unsui in Japanese, this spiritual term that we find in Zen Buddhism, means to drift like a cloud and flow like water. So that's what the enlightened mind is, right? Is to drift like a cloud and flow like water, where the mind is not stuck on anything. It's not stuck anywhere. It just, you move through life, and from Zhuangzi's perspective, you move effortlessly with the transformations of life. But you also know how to act immediately and appropriately to each and every situation, because you don't have all of this conditioning and belief system that makes you hesitant or makes you feel like you need to interfere with reality, right? When you have hesitancy or you feel like you need to interfere, it means the jiva is still at play. And so, as I said, the devotee is asking about how does it subside, this worldly stuff that we have going on in our head. And Bhagavan says, if the mind subsides, the whole world subsides. Mind is the cause of all this. If that subsides, the natural state presents itself. The self proclaims itself at all times as I. It is the self-luminous. It is here. All this is that. We are in that only. Being in it, why search for it? The ancients say, making the vision absorbed in jnana, one sees the world as Brahman. I love that exchange there, where it kind of began with Ramana's way of saying that, okay, the guru is essential sometimes, but at the same time, the guru won't teach you anything that you already don't know, because you're already the Atman. You already know you're that, but you believe that you're this person. And so in that sense, like the guru, if we translate, that means the dispeller of ignorance. Guru means the dispeller of ignorance. And so a teacher like that is supposed to dispel ignorance. And here, again, the ignorance of Brahman. And so that's the importance of a guru. Now, there are many things we could say about the modern guru culture in the 21st century, but we won't go there. So the next part is like dealing with desires, right? So a lot of people make a lot about desires in this day and age. And as you guys know, I've made plenty of videos on desires, not only from the perspective of the Ashtavakra Gita and the Avadhuta Gita. I've made videos from the Taoist perspective where Lao Tzu is explaining the desires of the belly and the desires of the mind. And I'll mention that after this exchange, because I think it's very poignant and sort of gives context to Ramana's reply to the devotee here. And so the devotee says to Ramana, what is the best way of dealing with desires and vasanas with a view to getting rid of them, satisfying them, or suppressing them? See, again, the inquiry is very practical. And there's nothing wrong with that per se, because these type of practical questions evoke a deeper response from Ramana. And so Ramana replies, if a desire can be got rid of by satisfying it, there will be no harm in satisfying such a desire. But desires generally are not eradicated by satisfaction. Trying to root them out that way is like trying to quench a fire by pouring inflammable spirits on it. At the same time, the proper remedy is not forcible suppression, since such suppression is bound to react sooner or later into a forceful surging up of desires with undesirable consequences. The proper way to get rid of a desire is to find out who gets the desire. What is its source? When this is found, the desire is rooted out and it will never again emerge or grow. Small desires, such as the desire to eat drink, sleep, and attend to calls of nature, though these may also be classed among desires, you can safely satisfy. They will not implant vasanas in your mind, necessitating further birth. Those activities are necessary to carry on life and are not likely to develop or leave behind vasanas or tendencies. As a general rule, therefore, there is no harm in satisfying a desire where the satisfaction will not lead to further desires by creating vasanas in the mind. And so the aspirant follows up, in the practice of meditation, are there any signs in the realm of subjective experience which will indicate the aspirant's progress towards self-realization? Ramana says the degree of freedom from unwanted thoughts and the degree of concentration on a single thought are the measures to gauge the progress. So again, Ramana throws the sort of linear, practical ways that we see desires and this knowledge on its head. Because when we talk about desires here, Ramana makes a lot of good points. Because there's an interesting phenomenon where you see people in the modern day who probably aren't familiar with Vedic culture, who come maybe from the West or come from somewhere else, maybe South America or Africa and this and that. And then the people get introduced to non-dualism without any sort of understanding of the deeper tenets of the Brahma Vidya, the knowledge of Brahman, and the great texts, right? And so then you get this tendency of the non-dual police. And so you guys have probably experienced this online where you might just say something which is very innocent, maybe in the comment section, but then the non-dual police will come and, hey, this is what it means, and everybody knows. But that also relates a lot to desires, right? Because I've seen some of these non-dual police will say, like, if someone desires food, for example. So you might desire pizza. And look, I always mention pizza because I love pizza. Who doesn't like pizza, right? And so, you're still a victim of your desire. And it's like, no. Like again, sometimes this knowledge has to be in the right hands and you have to understand it from its proper context. And why I mentioned Lao Tzu before is because Lao Tzu, to give this context, had a philosophy of the desires of the eye and the desires of the belly. Now, the desires of the belly are obviously the natural desires, right? So you must sleep, you must eat, you must quench your thirst. Maybe you want to have sex, natural things, right? Natural things that don't need to be overly analyzed. I am hungry, I eat. It's like Lin Chi's verse in the great Zen text where Lin Chi said, when hungry, eat, when tired, sleep. Like, it's not rocket science. Following the way of nature is not rocket science, but we try to, again, split the atom and we try and turn it into some sort of scientific endeavor without thinking intuitively about these teachings. Again, what Ramana would speak about and also what Zhuangzi would speak about. Zhuangzi is constantly talking about the intuitive experience. Whereas there's a story in the Zhuangzi where Zhuangzi sees the two fish dancing, right, in the water, and he's with his friend. And he's like, the fish are happy. You know what his friend said? His friend's a classic non-dual cop. His friend goes, how do you know they are happy? And Zhuangzi, being Zhuangzi, being humorous, how do you know I don't know they are happy? And so you have this constant debate, right? It's not a debate. The thing is that his friend has lost touch with the intuitive aspect of reality. You don't have to analyze whether the fish are happy. You can see that the fish are happy. You know when your dog is sprinting around the yard and chasing its tail, it's having a wonderful time. No one ever has walked up and said, that dog's having a terrible day. You don't need to do that. You know it. And so Zhuangzi is trying to reinforce we know certain things about the world where we don't have to split the atom. And so when that comes to the desires of the belly, from Lao Tzu's perspective, we don't have to split the atom, right? We know when we're hungry. We know when we're thirsty. We know when we want to go for a walk. We want to experience the sun. We want to get the hell away from these screens, So we don't need to be told that. We intuitively know when to do that. But to contrast the desires of the belly, as Lao Tzu says, is the desires of the eye. And these are the desires that they speak about in Eastern traditions and what Brahman is speaking about the devotee here. And these are the artificial desires built on whatever culture and society says is acceptable. So it's an external perspective, right? Hunger comes here. The urge for sex comes here. Everything comes from within here. Sure, there may be some suggestions from the outside, right? You might not like Burger King, but there's constant ad of Burger King, and then you feel like eating Burger King. Okay, we're talking again. We don't want to split the atom. But the artificial desires are those that come from the external world, from society and culture. And so think of Madison Avenue, right? Think of the advertising industry. Think about why someone is dressed up really strange and this and that. Why did they dress like that? Well, they were influenced by the desires of the eye, by those artificial desires. Unfortunately, in the modern world, majority of the world, I would say, is driven by the desires of the eye. Trying to have fame, have wealth, have success, all based on what they perceive of in their own mind. So they cook it up in their own mind. They have an idea of what wealthy is, of what fame is, and what success is. And then you could share that view with someone else, and someone else will have a different perspective. It's not like a universal type of idea. It's like when we look at morality, right? Morality itself is not universal. Different cultures and different belief systems have different perspectives of morality. And when we look at the non-dualist traditions are amoral because morality implies a this and that. It doesn't mean that you don't do good in the world. It just means, again, that you're driven by the desires of the belly, your fundamental goodness that you don't need to be told to be good. You know inherently that you are good, but it's the world around you that makes you, in some sense, act in a way that is out of accord with who you truly are. So that's desires done. Now we're getting into more of the non-personal aspects of Bhagavan's teachings, which are actually, well, we can say the higher teachings. So we've spoken about the nature of realization, the aid of a guru, dealing with desires. Now we're going to speak about, is the world an illusion? So the devotee asks Ramana, Sri Bhagavan often says that Maya, illusion, and reality are the same. How can that be? Now, again, Maya here, you got to remember the illusion of measurement. Now, look, guys, I know I speak about it all the time, but I have to reinforce that mentality because some people will think, it's the illusion, like, I can put my hand through a wall. And there's a lot of people that try to equate Eastern spirituality and philosophy with something like quantum physics. And in a lot of sense, they are very far apart. And we see a lot of that now also with simulation theory, where a lot of people will try to equate it with Eastern philosophy and spirituality. For whatever reason, in the modern day, we have this tendency to try and make everything universal. So there's this real radical universalism. And, in a lot of sense, things are different. That's what diversity is. That's how we can understand from things. But the irony is, in the modern world, we're trying to champion diversity by making things the same, which is paradoxical. So, as I said, Bhagavan often says that Maya and reality are the same. How can that be? And then Ramana actually says, Shankara was criticized for his views on Maya without being understood. He said that Brahman is real, the universe is unreal, and the universe is Brahman. Now, I've done many videos on this. And in Sanskrit, actually, this is Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya. Now, what Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya means is that all is Brahman, the world is an appearance. Now, you'll understand that a bit more as I go further on. And look, I've explained it ad nauseum with you guys on the channel. And I know a lot of you have probably understood it, but it's something we should always talk about because Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya is one of the core Sanskrit phrases that helps you understand, outside of the Mahavakyas, helps you understand the nature of the ultimate reality. So Ramana continues, Shankara did not stop at the second line. So the second line was the universe is unreal. And the third line obviously was, and the universe is Brahman. Ramana continues, because the third explains the other two, it signifies as real if perceived as the self, and unreal if perceived apart from the self. Hence, Maya and reality are one and the same. And so the devotee says, so the world is not really illusory? Ramana says, at the level of the spiritual seeker, you have got to say that the world is an illusion. So here he's addressing most of us as spiritual aspirants. So using the idea that the world is an illusion, Ramana understands that the world is not. He understands it's all Brahman. But using it as a tool to evoke a deeper understanding. So Ramana continues, there is no other way. So when a man forgets that he is Brahman, who is real, permanent, and omnipresent, and deludes himself into thinking that he is a body in the universe, which is filled with bodies that are transitory and labors under that delusion,
You have got to remind him that the world is unreal and a delusion. Why? Because this vision, which has forgotten its own self, is dwelling in the external, material universe. It will not turn inwards into introspection unless you impress on him that all this external material universe is unreal. Once he realizes his own self, he will know that there is nothing other than his own self, and he will come to look upon the whole universe as Brahman. There is no universe without the self. So long as a man does not see the self, which is the origin of all, but looks only at the external world as real and permanent, you have to tell him that all this external universe is an illusion. You cannot help it. Take a paper. We see only the script, and nobody notices the paper on which the script is written. The paper is there whether the script on it is there or not. To those who look upon the script as real, you have to say that it is unreal and illusion since it rests upon the paper. The wise man looks upon both the paper and the script as one. So also with Brahman and the universe. The devotee follows up. So the world is real when it is experienced as the self, the Atman, and unreal when it is seen as separate names and form. Ramana says, just as fire is obscured by smoke, the shining light of consciousness is obscured by the assemblage of names and forms, the world. When by compassionate divine grace the mind becomes clear, the nature of the world will be known to be not the illusory forms, but only the reality. Only those people whose minds are devoid of the evil power of Maya, having given up the knowledge of the world and being unattached to it, and having thereby attained the knowledge of the self-shining supreme reality, can correctly know the meaning of the statement, the world is real. If one's outlook has been transformed to the nature of real knowledge, the world of the five elements, beginning with ether, Akash, will be real, being the supreme reality, which is the nature of knowledge. The original state of the empty world, which is bewildering and crowded with many names and forms, is bliss, which is one, just as the egg yolk of the multicolored peacock is only one. Know this truth by abiding in the state of self. And then the devotee continues, I cannot say it is all clear to me. Is the world that is seen, felt, and sensed by us in so many ways something like a dream, an illusion? Ramana says, there is no alternative for you but to accept the world as unreal if you are seeking the truth and the truth alone. The devotee says, why so? Ramana says, for the simple reason that unless you give up the idea that the world is real, your mind will always be after it. If you take the appearance to be real, you will never know the real itself, although it is the real alone that exists. This point is illustrated by the analogy of the snake in the rope. You may be deceived into believing that a piece of rope is a snake. While you imagine that the rope is a snake, you cannot see the rope as a rope. The non-existent snake becomes real to you, while the real rope seems wholly non-existent as such. And so that's an important metaphor, right? The rope and the snake analogy. You guys know I often use this metaphor a lot. I mean, Ramana is using a bunch in what we're reading at the moment. Like he uses the text and the paper, right? So like we forget the paper, but we read the script. I mean, even then I'm reading the script, right? I'm reading the words on the paper. And you momentarily forget the paper, right? Because you're engrossed in the script. That's one of the things, right? Like we're so involved in this linguistic framework we have in our mind. So with this linguistic framework, we project that onto the world around us. And then we suffer accordingly if the world doesn't accord to the names and forms that we've ascribed them. And so that's one of the big problems. And on the spiritual path, it's about cleansing that linguistic framework. It doesn't mean you become a mute and you don't speak, obviously not. But it means you're not stuck or caught in the concepts and the names and even the forms that you've ascribed the world around you. You are free from that. And so then that you can have the mind of Zhuangzi, for example, Xiao Yao Yu, you can have the free and easy wandering mindset where you're not caught in this or that. Things can happen around you. Someone can say something to you, and it will be like wind just blowing through you. And so, if only we were taught about the rope and the snake when we were a child. And so that's why that phrase, Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya, is one of the most important phrases in all of world literature, because Brahman is real, the universe is unreal, and the universe is Brahman. It's a paradoxical statement, but it's taking you through the whole gamut of understanding reality. It's like the Zen verse of Tozan, where Tozan said, before enlightenment, the mountain was the mountain, the lake was the lake. I got confused. I searched for enlightenment. The mountain was a lake, the lake was the mountain. After enlightenment, the mountain was the mountain, the lake was the lake. In typical Zen paradoxical fashion, it's a similar sentiment as to Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya, because Tozan experienced reality as a certain way, and then he believed in a type of way of developing himself, a way of understanding the world, which flipped everything on its head. But then he realized that fundamental nature was already what it is before his enlightenment. It's, again, it's like the chopping wood and carrying water metaphor. And so the universe is unreal when we are looking at it from the perspective of name and form. When we're looking at it from the perspective of probably the last two, spiritual aspirants that Bhagavan was talking about. And so ultimately, Brahman is real, right? So the universe can only be real if perceived as Brahman, if perceived in its one natural unity, actually. You often hear Krishnamurti talking about this when he talks about that the identity is limited, because the identity operates from a state of limits. So it dissects the world up into this and that according to its own limitation. And the role, according to Krishnamurti, which coincides with the Eastern spiritual traditions, is we need to have that real sense of wholeness, that real sense of unity. Not as lip service, not as you read it in a book, you wrote it down, but as an actual reality for yourself. You actually experience a real knowing in the core of your being that oneness is the true reality. And that's what Krishnamurti was talking about. But you can't understand that oneness is the true reality when you come and you operate from that limited identity. And so the last part in Ramana's teachings is the world created for happiness or misery. I'm pretty sure that you guys can answer this one. But Ramana's got a really great perspective on this. So the devotee goes right into this, right? Is the world created for happiness or misery? Ramana says, creation is neither good nor bad. It is as it is. It is the human mind which puts all sorts of constructions on it, seeing things from its own angle and interpreting them to suit its own interests. A woman is just a woman, but one mind calls her mother, another sister, and still another aunt, and so on. Men love women, hate snakes, and are indifferent to the grass and the stones by the roadside. These value judgments are the cause of all the misery in the world. Creation is like a peepal tree. Birds come to eat its fruit or take shelter under its branches. Men cool themselves in its shade, but some may hang themselves on it. Yet the tree continues to lead its quiet life, unconcerned with and unaware of all the uses it is put to. It is the human mind that creates its own difficulties and then cries for help. Is God so partial as to give peace to one person and sorrow to another? In creation, there is room for everything, but man refuses to see the good, the healthy, and the beautiful. Instead, he goes on whining like the hungry man who sits beside the tasty dish and who, instead of stretching out his hand to satisfy his hunger, goes on lamenting. Whose fault is it? God's or man's? The devotee says, if God is all, why does the individual suffer for his actions? Are not the actions for which the individual is made to suffer prompted by him? Bhagavan says, he who thinks he is the doer is also the sufferer. The devotee replies, but the actions are prompted by God, and the individual is only his tool. Bhagavan replies, this logic is applied only when one suffers, but not when one rejoices. If the conviction prevails always, there will be no suffering either. The devotee replies, when will the suffering cease? Bhagavan says, not until individuality is lost. If both the good and bad actions are his, why should you think that the enjoyment and suffering are yours alone? He who does good or bad also enjoys pleasure or suffers pain. Leave it there and do not superimpose suffering on yourself. The devotee then replies, How can you say that suffering is non-existent? I see it everywhere. Ramana says, one's own reality, which shines within everyone as the heart, is itself the ocean of unalloyed bliss. Therefore, like the unreal blueness of the sky, misery does not exist in reality, but only in mere imagination. Since one's own reality, which is the sun of jnana that cannot be approached by the dark delusion of ignorance, itself shines as happiness. Misery is nothing but an illusion caused by the unreal sense of individuality. In truth, no one has ever experienced any such thing other than that unreal illusion. If one scrutinizes one's own self, which is bliss, there will be no misery at all in one's life. One suffers because the idea that the body, which is never oneself, is I. Suffering is all due to this delusion. The mental attitude needed to understand the deeper knowledge that we spoke about in the Divi Colloquium is to get out of this understanding of right and wrong, good and bad. These are subjective perspectives that are based on our conditioning. Now, you will be dedicated to understanding that if you're dedicated to the spiritual path. A lot of people will make justifications or cop-outs to try and justify their own view of the world. They may be an activist, for example, so they try to justify their own subjective viewpoint. They're not made for the spiritual path. It's just the way it is. It's just the way it is. And so creation is neither good nor bad. Now, this is an Eastern spiritual and philosophical perspective across the board, because good and bad equate to a subjective viewpoint based on a culture or an individual's sense of morality. Now, we are fundamentally natural and we are fundamentally good, but we learn about a world that doesn't exist. And so I remember a teacher said to me a long time ago, and when I was younger, I didn't quite grasp it, when he said, the whole world is mind. And, you could think, oh, okay, the whole world is mind. Like, what are we talking about here? The subatomic reality, quantum physics? No, he purely meant that everything in the world is a manifestation of someone's idea of what the world should be. And we are existing in that. And so some things are good, right? It's not to say that anything is not meant to be, but the way society and culture has developed, you can tell it's a manifestation of the mind. You can go to certain places in the world and you can tell it's a manifestation of the spirit. And so these texts, these dialogues, everything I'm talking to you about today is a manifestation of that unmanifest world. It's the unmanifest manifest. Whereas what goes on in the world, the artificial desires, like we were speaking about, are manifestations of the mind. And unfortunately, we all live in that world. And in some sense, we've always lived in that sort of world, but it's become more prevalent and it's expanded a lot due to the evolution of the species and the evolution of technology and the evolution of everything, right? So, and that's why if you look at reality in a sense that if you accept that we're in the Kali Yuga and you accept that majority of humanity have and or are in the process of turning their back on the true nature of reality because they're so invested in their own individualistic plight in life, then you'll understand that we are truly in the Kali Yuga, that these texts and what you and I are talking about today are exactly what was said when Vyas left the great knowledge behind, when he wrote the Puranas, when he wrote the Mahabharata, all of these great texts for the spiritual starved in the Kali Yuga. If we take that as a true story, it was very intuitive and perceptive of him. And we are all living in the grace of great teachers such as him and Ramana as well, that have left all of this knowledge behind for us. And they're no longer with us. And we have all this great knowledge to discuss. And it just means the most to me anyway. And I know it probably means the most to a lot of you as well. And I know that a lot of people on my channel are dedicated to this knowledge and an understanding that possibly we're in the Kali Yuga and maybe our role in the Kali Yuga is to keep this knowledge alive. Not in the sense that we are going to promote it or we're going to hit the streets and hand out pamphlets like a Jehovah's Witness, but keep it alive with the people who know, the Sangha. I often like to call all of you the Shanti Sangha. And so the Shanti Sangha is always growing every day. But there's many sanghas around the world that we're keeping this knowledge alive. So, okay, guys, Shanti, 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 Shanti.